Did you know that in the United States, death row inmates are allowed to request almost anything for their last meal before execution? Cheeseburgers, fries, and chocolate cake are the most common requests, but some go much further and make such bizarre requests that it's hard to believe. Today, we're going to dive into the strangest last meal requests made by prisoners about to face the end of their lives. But before we start, if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, click the red button and hit the bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Currently, the death penalty is legal in 29 states in the United States, and in many of them, the condemned have the right to a last meal. However, the rules about these meals vary from state to state. For example, in Florida, the limit is $40, while in Oklahoma, it can't exceed $25. But in Texas, this tradition ended in 2011, and the reason was the absurd request made by Lawrence Russell Brewer, which we'll talk about later. Case 1. Lawrence Russell Brewer. Lawrence Russell Brewer is a name marked not only by the brutality of his crimes, but also by his last meal, which sparked significant controversy. In 1998, Brewer was sentenced to death for a heinous hate crime that shocked the United States. He was one of the perpetrators of the brutal murder of James Byrd Jr., a black man who was chained to the back of a truck and dragged for miles down a rural Texas road in one of the most cruel acts of racism in recent history. But beyond the violence of his actions, Lawrence Brewer will also be remembered for the impact he had on one of the oldest death row traditions, the right to a last meal. Brewer did not hold back when choosing his last supper. He requested an absurd amount of food: 2 whole fried chickens, 3 bacon cheeseburgers, a stuffed omelet, fried okra, a serving of barbecue meat, 3 fajitas, a giant pizza, a bowl of ice cream, peanut butter, and to top it off, 3 cold beers. If this sounds excessive, it was. Brewer seemed to want to turn his final moments into a gastronomic feast worthy of a grand banquet. However, what happened next left everyone stunned. When the enormous meal was delivered to Brewer, he simply looked at the feast and said he wasn't hungry. That's right, he ate absolutely nothing. This act of disdain caused such outrage among authorities that, shortly after, the state of Texas made a radical decision. It completely abolished the tradition of the last meal. Since 2011, death row inmates in Texas no longer have the right to request their final meal. Instead, they receive the same food served to other prisoners on the day of execution, without any special choices. So, what seemed like a mere whim of Lawrence Russell Brewer ended up changing a decades-old tradition in the state. His last meal, or rather, the lack of it, left a deep mark on the history of death row in Texas. Case 2. James Edward Smith. James Edward Smith, sentenced to death in 1990, was the protagonist of one of the strangest and most unusual last meal requests in death row history. Unlike most prisoners who opt for an indulgent meal, Smith made a request that left everyone baffled. Dirt, but not just any dirt. He specifically requested a type of soil used in voodoo rituals, known as Rayakunda. According to reports, James Edward Smith, who believed in spiritual practices and voodoo rituals, wanted to use the dirt in a final rite. For him, this soil held deep spiritual significance, something that could, in his view, help him prepare for what would come after death. He intended to use the dirt in a protective ritual, or even for reincarnation. However, the prison in Huntsville, Texas, rejected the request, stating that it was not feasible to provide such material. As an alternative, and rather anticlimactically, Smith had to settle for something much simpler and mundane: a yogurt. Without the dirt he so desired, his last moments before execution were marked by this basic food. But what really stands out in James Edward Smith's story is not just his peculiar request, but what happened in his final moments. It is said that, frustrated by not being able to perform his ritual, he placed a curse on the prison. Smith purportedly cursed Huntsville, vowing that his spirit would haunt the city for 300 years. Whether you believe in the curse or not, the fact remains that to this day, some say that strange events occur around the Huntsville prison. Guards and staff report unexplained noises, mysterious footsteps, and a feeling of being watched when walking through the corridors at night. Could Smith's spirit really be fulfilling his promise? It's fascinating how, even in the final moments, some prisoners seek not just a meal, but something that goes beyond the physical, touching on spiritual beliefs and ancestral rituals. James Edward Smith certainly left us with more questions than answers. This is another intriguing story that illustrates how, even in the darkest moments, humanity can surprise us with its choices and beliefs. Case 3. Philip Workman. The case of Philip Workman is undoubtedly one of the most moving when it comes to last meal requests on death row. Sentenced to death in 2007 for the murder of a police officer during a botched robbery, Workman had a troubled past marked by drug involvement and a series of poor choices. However, his final request, unlike his criminal history, revealed an unexpected side of compassion. When it was time for his last request, Workman didn't ask for an extravagant feast or luxurious food. Instead, he made a much more altruistic request. What did he he ask for? A vegetarian pizza, but here's the touching detail. He didn't want the pizza for himself. Workman requested that the pizza be delivered to a homeless person. Unfortunately, the prison's strict rules did not allow for his request to be fulfilled. The Nashville Prison Administration denied the request, arguing that laws prohibited food from being given to someone outside the prison. For Workman, his last meal ended up being simple and solitary, but his gesture resonated deeply. Although the prison rejected his wish, the story quickly spread, and Workman's selfless request touched many hearts. In response, residents of Nashville and various other parts of the United States decided to take action. In an act of solidarity, hundreds of pizzas began to be donated to homeless people in his honor. This simple act of kindness inspired a true wave of compassion. Not only in Nashville, but in places like Minneapolis and Houston, people started donating pizzas to charities and shelters, honoring Philip Workman's last wish. The pizza he could never deliver was, in a way, shared by many. This case reminds us that no matter how dark the circumstances may be, even at the end of the line, we can still find gestures of humanity. Workman's request may not have been fulfilled, but the generosity he inspired touched countless lives, showing that an act of kindness can emerge even in the most unexpected places. While many prisoners use their last meal for personal indulgences, Philip Workman chose to think of others, and his action continues to be remembered as a symbol of redemption and compassion. Case 4. Victor Feguer. Victor Feguer, sentenced to death in 1963, was the last prisoner to be executed by hanging in the state of Iowa, but he's remembered for more than just that fact. Feguer's last meal request is one of the most enigmatic and symbolic in death row history. When it came time to make his final request, Feguer didn't choose an elaborate dish or opt for a grand meal like many other prisoners. Instead, he made a simple but profoundly symbolic request: a single olive with the pit. Feguer explained that his intention in asking for this olive was to plant a seed of peace within himself. He hoped that after his death, the olive would germinate and grow into an olive tree, a universal symbol of peace and renewal. For him, this act represented a message of hope, as if, even amidst violence and condemnation, it was possible to find a sign of tranquility and life. The symbolism of this request did not go unnoticed. The olive tree, historically associated with peace and reconciliation, became an icon in the story of Victor Feguer, a man condemned for kidnapping and murder. Even in his final moments, he chose something that could have a lasting significance, something that transcended death itself. For many, Feguer's request was an act of repentance, an attempt to leave a peaceful mark on a world in which he had caused pain. Although no one knows if the olive actually sprouted, the idea that Feguer wanted his last meal to be a symbol of peace continues to intrigue and touch those who know his story. Sometimes, it's the simplest choices that carry the deepest meanings. Victor Feguer's olive with the pit reminds us that even in the darkest moments, we can still find traces of hope and redemption. Case 5. Ronnie Lee Gardner. Ronnie Lee Gardner, sentenced to death in Utah, became one of the last prisoners to choose firing squad as his method of execution in the United States. His brutal crime and sentence were already shocking, but what drew attention was his request for his final hours. While most death row inmates make curious or extravagant last meal requests, Gardner had something else in mind. He wanted to watch the complete The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Yes, those 3 epic fantasy films that total nearly 12 hours of runtime. Gardner was a confessed fan of J.R.R. Tolkien's work, and his intention was to spend his last hours immersed in the epic battles of Middle-earth, perhaps finding some form of escapism in the grand settings and struggles for the fate of the world. It was an unexpected choice, but in a way, it was profoundly human, a desire to spend his final moments in a world different from the one where he committed his crimes. Of course, his last meal also had to be part of the experience. Lobster, a juicy steak, vanilla ice cream, apple pie, and a 7-Up completed his gastronomic farewell. While his food choices might seem relatively common compared to some other inmates, it was the request to spend his last hours watching The Lord of the Rings saga that truly defined his story. This unusual decision leads us to ponder what goes through someone's mind in their final moments: a search for comfort, distraction, or perhaps a temporary escape from the reality they are about to confront. What we can say is that for a few hours, Gardner managed to disconnect from his inevitable fate, traveling with Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn through a fantasy world where survival battles take on forms quite different from those he knew. And so, while Gardner sought refuge in epic films, our next prisoner was marked by a much simpler decision, yet with a touch of bitterness. Case 6. William Bonin. William Bonin, known as the Freeway Killer, was one of the most feared serial killers in California during the 1970s and 1980s. Convicted of kidnapping, torturing, and murdering at least 21 young men, Bonin spread terror wherever he went, and his execution in 1996 marked the end of a reign of fear. When it came time to face his execution, Bonin made a last meal request that seemed almost simple given his brutal history: 2 pepperoni pizzas and 3 scoops of chocolate ice cream. But what really drew attention to his request was the beverage accompaniment. Bonin asked for no less than 18 bottles of Coca-Cola. That's right, 18 bottles. Now you might be wondering, why would someone request so much Coke to go with their meal? The motivations behind such requests are always a mystery, but in Bonin's case, it might have been an attempt at excess or even a final act of defiance. Did he manage to drink all those bottles of soda? It's unlikely, but Bonin's request has gone down in history as one of the most curious and eccentric ever made by a death row inmate. Between his heinous crimes and his unusual meal request, William Bonin's story is another that makes us question what goes through someone's mind in their final moments. Case 7, Ricky Ray Rector. Ricky Ray Rector was sentenced to death in 1992 for the murders of 2 people, including a police officer who had been his childhood friend. What made his execution even more controversial was his mental state. Many argued that he lacked full awareness of his actions due to a self-inflicted brain injury. When it came time to make his last meal request, Rector chose something relatively traditional: a steak, fried chicken, cherry juice, and a pecan pie. Nothing too out of the ordinary, right? But what marked his final meal was what he did with the pie. After finishing his meal, Rector left the pie untouched, writing a note on the tray that said, "I'm going to eat this later." This simple phrase, in such a tragic and definitive context, left many people perplexed. How could someone who knew they were about to die say they were going to eat later? It is believed that this action reflected Rector's disturbed mental state, perhaps indicating that he did not fully comprehend that there would be no opportunity to eat later. His case sparked heated debates about the execution of prisoners with mental health issues. This simple and unsettling gesture remains one of the most strange and enigmatic last meals ever recorded on death row. Case 8, Thomas J. Grasso. Thomas J. Grasso, sentenced to death in 1995, is remembered not only for his crimes, but also for his final meal request. Convicted of murder and robbery, Grasso's last meal was a monumental request, fit for a grand feast. He asked for steamed mussels, a double cheeseburger from Burger King, grilled chops, a strawberry milkshake, and a can of SpaghettiOs. However, what should have been a satisfying final meal ended in frustration. When the food arrived, Grasso noticed that the canned spaghetti he had requested was missing. Instead, the prison served him regular spaghetti, a mistake that triggered his anger. Grasso was furious about the error, and his last words reflected his dissatisfaction. "I didn't get my SpaghettiOs. They made me eat regular spaghetti." This frustration over a final meal might seem trivial, but for Grasso, who was facing execution, the difference between canned spaghetti and regular spaghetti seemed like a significant detail. The mistake in his final meal became an example of how even the smallest details can impact a prisoner in their final moments. And Grasso's discontent with the regular spaghetti became a symbol of his frustration and resentment. Case 9, Jonathan Nobles. Jonathan Nobles, sentenced to death in 1998 for 2 murders, had a story that unfolded in a rather unique way. Following his conviction, Nobles underwent a significant personal and spiritual transformation. He converted to Christianity. As his execution approached, Nobles made a last meal request that reflected this new phase of his life. Rather than opting for extravagant or opulent meals, Nobles' request was deeply symbolic and spiritual. For his final meal, Jonathan Nobles asked only for the Eucharist, a sacred ceremony in the Catholic Christian tradition. The Eucharist is a ritual that symbolizes the Last Supper of Jesus Christ with his disciples, where bread and wine represent the body and blood of Christ. Nobles was provided with a consecrated host and a cup of wine, representing his desire to reconcile and connect with his faith before his final moments. This singular request highlights how faith and spirituality can influence even the most personal decisions in times of crisis. For Jonathan Nobles, this final meal was not just a concluding act, but a statement of his new beliefs and a spiritual preparation for what lay ahead. Case 10, Odell Barnes. We come to our final case, which is undoubtedly one of the most symbolic and impactful. Odell Barnes, sentenced to death in 2000, made a last meal request that challenged conventions and expressed a deep desire for social and global change. Unlike other prisoners who opted for traditional or extravagant meals, Barnes made a request that did not involve food at all. Instead, he asked solely for justice, equality, and world peace. This request was not merely a personal wish, but a powerful statement and appeal for a better world. Barnes, who had been convicted of murdering his girlfriend girlfriend, used his final moments to advocate for universal principles that transcend the context of capital punishment. His request resonated with many as a call to reflect on issues of justice and equality in our society. Rather than choosing a final meal, Barnes turned his last words into a platform for a collective desire for change. This final meal request highlights the complexity of emotions and thoughts that can arise in one's final moments. Barnes did not seek comfort or indulgence, but expressed a profound wish for a more just and harmonious world. And there you have it. What did you think of these final meal requests? Which one surprised you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating curiosities like this. See you next time.